to this live. Welcome to this live stream for the AERM, the Alliance of the European Republic Movement. And what could be better for a nice, warm, sunny evening than to learn more about our different monarchies in Europe. The Swedish monarchy and Netherlands monarchy and the British monarchy and their legal and informal power. That's today's issue. Welcome all. My name is Helena Westin. I'm the Vice President of the Swedish Republic Movement. And today we have 3 other participants. From Sweden, Olle Nyqvist, and from the UK, Graham Smith, and from the Netherlands, Floris Miller. You're all very welcome. Thank you. And I'll let you introduce yourself. So let's start with Floris.
Yes, good afternoon. It's probably as warm here in the Netherlands as it is in Sweden. It's supposed to be the warmest day this summer. But enough about the weather. I am Floris Müller. I am the Vice President of the Dutch board of the Republican Society called Republikeins Genootschap. And I've been in this position, I believe, since half a year. Before that, I worked as the Secretary of the board of the Dutch Republican Society. I must say we're doing quite a lot. Though we've had quite some stress with Corona, we find our ways of communicating, especially online.
Yeah, great. So, welcome, Graham.
Yeah, hi, I'm Graham Smith. I'm the CEO of Republic. And yeah, I've been doing this for a long time now. I think we'll come to all the issues that we campaign on during the course of these programs, so I won't go on much more about me.
Okay, that was not a very good sound. Did anyone else hear that
Yeah,
better than I did?
Sort of interference.
There is a lot of interference, as I understand. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Olle, and then we go back to Graham again.
Hi, I'm Ollie. I'm the International Secretary for the Swedish Republican Association. And just like Floris and in the Netherlands, we have, of course, been very affected by the coronavirus, but we find ways to try and stay relevant and communicate our cause as of today. And we are on the verge of releasing our annual report on the real cost of the monarchy, which is, I believe, going to be an upcoming episode in this stream. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Graham, is your sound any better right now?
I don't know. You tell me.
No.
But I'll see what I can do, but take me off the screen for the moment.
No, okay, try to fix it. And we'll go to our first question. I was just thinking, what in our different countries, are there any current issues concerning power and monarchy, influence and formal power or informal power in your country right now? What about you in Netherlands? Do you have something that's on the top?
Yeah. Your question is there something going on with the monarchy at this very moment?
Yes.
Yes, well, obviously there always is, but to just pick out one little news story that hasn't really hit the news in the Netherlands is that in the height of the corona crisis, and we still don't know where it's going to go financially wise, our king has quite recently bought himself a boat of 2 million euros. And that's rather, I don't think that's the kind of message you would like to share. So that's for the news. We've had quite some debate about affairs like this, about art, about palaces that have been renovated for millions and millions of euros, all on the cost of our taxpayers, of course. So it's a continuous stream, and it's mostly about money and expenditures. And I don't know how that's organized in Sweden, but here in the Netherlands, our monarchy is not responsible for whatever they do. So it's the prime minister and his team that are responsible for whatever our king does. And in affairs like this, you won't get any comment. You'll get other very positive news. You'll get other very positive news about the monarchy, about different members of our royal family, but that's it. So these are just two little news facts that have come out quite recently. The massive cost of our palaces, and furthermore, his little boat he bought for 2 million.
Okay, and that we'll come back to the costs of the monarchy, hidden or transparent, in our next live stream in 4 weeks. So thank you, Floris. What about Ole? What are we talking about in Sweden?
Well, right now we're not talking about a whole lot concerning the royals. Actually, we had a sort of State of the Union by our king concerning the Corona crisis, which sort of highlighted the old argument that he's supposed to be this unifying symbol, and well, we'll dispute that. Otherwise, just like Floris said about the boat, our king chose to buy a very luxurious car, which was in the news. Other than that, it's all Corona. So the Republic question has really gotten in the shadow of that, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. So what about in Britain? What are you talking about? And can we hear you, Graham?
Well, that's the big question. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
So, excellent. So, yeah, the lighting's not great here. I'm not having a great time with this today, but yeah, I mean, you know, like with everything else, the coronavirus and more recently Black Lives Matter and so on has all dominated the news. But, you know, we have just had a report out this today, in fact, about Prince Charles's income going up 3% to something like £22 million a year, which is a huge amount of money that we're giving him via the Duchy of Cornwall. So, and that is very much tied up with a lot of the power and influence that Prince Charles has as the Duke of Cornwall. So that's all coming up. I've been told that the Buckingham Palace report will be delayed because of the coronavirus. I don't think they want to admit to a massive hike in their grant in the middle of what's going on.
Okay, thank you. So we're all influenced of the coronavirus. I think we have that in common. But for today's issue, we're going to learn more about formal power and informal power of the monarchies in our different countries. And we start with the formal power and exercise and differences and similarities and legal privileges. So will you start describing that, Floris?
Yeah, our monarchy is officially, we have a so-called constitutional monarchy, meaning that the power of our king is bounded by law, is limited by law. But if you look in practice, there is still a lot of power that our monarchy has ever since it was installed in 1815, say 200 years ago. We have limited their powers throughout the ages, but there's still quite a lot of formal power, meaning our king is still head of state, formal head of state. He is still the president of one of the most important advisory boards of our government. Whenever a government is installed, our government has to present itself to the king. That is all formal, but still, it's a kind of power. And furthermore, he has a lot of judicial power, meaning that if you have a law case, all laws get the signature of our king. When you have a law case and you go to our to court, there is a big painting or photo of our king. So there are all these little remnants of very strict and very visible power. They are still there, making it. Well, he has formal power, but it's very limited. But it's still there.
Still there. And do you see in some cases that he uses the power?
Well, it's very. That's the thing.
Or...
It's very difficult to really say he has used his power, but obviously, as everybody who's a member of parliament is named and gets permission from a king, and if you install a government, you have to get the formal okay from a king. That is not, you don't know what the king says or does. So that's the problem, I think, with any monarchy nowadays. Obviously, you can limit the power, but then in practice, you don't know what he's going to do with that power. It's all behind closed doors. It's all behind palace doors. We do not have an idea. We quite recently, this is approximately 5-6 years ago, we limited the power because our king would name somebody who would form a government. That was now limited, and he doesn't do that anymore. But still, you don't know what happens behind closed doors. So it's really hard to say he does, and he used his power for this and that.
Mm-hmm. Sounds a bit like the situation in Sweden. Would you like to describe that, Ole?
Yes, exactly. At the risk of repeating myself, just as Flores said, we are a constitutional monarchy, but I would probably say that out of the three of us, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the UK, the Swedish model is probably the most limited when it comes to formal power. Our king heads the sort of special cabinet meeting at the change of government, but he does not confirm government, so to speak, or confirm a cabinet. He does also chair the meetings of the Foreign Relations Committee, which is a committee appointed by Parliament to confer with the king and government most important foreign relations matters, basically. And furthermore, he opens the annual meeting of Parliament, or let's say the parliamentary year. But I think the most, in the sort of formal sense, the sort of special information cabinet meetings that the prime minister is obligated to hold with the king to inform him on certain matters is the most demonstrable power that he can wield, basically. And of course, he has immunity from charges. Criminal charges, which is, of course, very, very much a power to wield.
Are there any examples of the king using his power in more ways or more matters than he should?
Informally, yes, but if we're speaking formally, he has maybe. He has spoken out on issues every now and then and has been blasted by the public for that. So I feel like our king is very cautious about maybe stepping into those territories and keeps his boundaries fairly well, I would say, in my personal opinion. But you, as Flores said, at the risk of repeating myself, again, you don't know what goes on behind those closed doors at cabinet meetings.
No, that's right. So let's move to UK, Britain. So what about formal power of your monarchy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a confused situation because our constitution is not codified in a single document. And quite often people are unsure what those powers are. But I mean, formally and technically, the Queen has vast amounts of power called royal prerogative, but she is required by convention to only exercise those powers on the advice of the Prime Minister. And when they say advice, they mean the instruction of the Prime Minister. But in the Queen's lifetime, it's been argued that she has had the power to the right to exercise some powers independently. So back in the 1950s, the Conservative Party was in power, and they didn't have an open democratic process for choosing a leader. So there was all sort of conversations behind closed doors and so on. And the Queen was put in a position where she took someone's advice to appoint Harold Macmillan when people expected it to be someone else. And that was something which I think caused some raised eyebrows, and the Conservative Party moved towards electing their leaders after that. But it's potentially possible that the Prime Minister, the Queen can choose who to appoint as Prime Minister, and there may still be circumstances where that is the case. And certainly in since 2010, we've had a number of elections where there has been a hung parliament, where no party has a single party has a majority, and it's possible that you have a situation where it's very unclear that anyone can command a majority, and so the monarch may need to make a decision, which is a very difficult position for her to be in. She's always said that she wouldn't get into that. It's also been argued that certainly back in 1990, when Margaret Thatcher was in a lot of trouble, it was suggested or rumoured that she might want to dissolve Parliament and call an election in order to save her career as Prime Minister, to head off her own party from getting rid of her. And it was being argued that the Queen had the right to refuse a dissolution of Parliament in those sorts of circumstances. Didn't come to that. But there's a lot of uncertainty, really. So we sort of rely on the circumstances to work themselves out, the politicians to resolve any difficulties, and for the Queen to keep out of it. But just before Christmas, she suspended Parliament on the advice of Boris Johnson in order to, well, it certainly argued that that was to do with political manoeuvrings around Brexit. It was then ruled that that suspension was unconstitutional, but people argued that the Queen had to do it because she was told to do so. So we have a curious situation where people say that our constitution requires our head of state to do something unconstitutionally when told to do so by the Prime Minister, which is a very strange situation. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. But as I said, there are vast powers, such as signing treaties, going to war and so on, but which are always exercised on the advice of the Prime Minister, but they are exercised by her.
But it's a little different situation in the UK. Then I wonder those recent issues. Has there been increasing discussion of concerning the Constitution relating to those incidents or happenings, what you call them, situations?
Well, over the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about the Constitution. People tend to steer away from sort of looking at one of the obvious fault lines, which is the monarchy and the royal prerogative powers, because it's kind of too difficult for them to grapple with, and politicians are reluctant to deal with it. But I mean, that is one of the major fault lines that's been in the system over the last few years. And normally, however, the Constitution doesn't get discussed because we have a electoral system that gives us majority governments most of the time. And so the last sort of since the 2017 election, so for about 3 years, we had a very difficult situation where there was a minority government trying to do something which is hugely controversial, which divided Parliament in all sorts of different ways, and the Constitution started to play out in a much more public way. So I think there is, now Boris Johnson has a large majority, so that conversation has died down a little bit. But I think that's still a very serious, a lot of serious issues came out of that, and it's not clear where that will lead us, if anywhere.
We'll see what happens. Okay. Do you have any reflections of the similarities and differences between our countries in this issue?
Can I say, I feel like the issue here is whether or not you have a sort of clear vision of what the monarchy is, and like in the Swedish and the Dutch model, we have a constitution that clearly states the sort of limitations and the rules and the boundaries of the monarchy, whereas in the UK it's more fleeting and not clear, which I feel is very much a clear issue for in this, and that's where we have a difference between sort of the
but
UK.
If I may react to that, I think that the more you make it visible, like Great Britain, but obviously Graham is going to respond to this, but the more the former power is obvious and you see what a monarchy does, I think it becomes much easier to attack or to say, you know, this is not right in a more neutral way. Whereas I think in Sweden and the Netherlands, as we have all these institutions trying to cover up and try to bury it under a lot of laws and a lot of influence of different prime ministers and etc. It doesn't really become clear. It doesn't come out what they do, why they do it, what kind of power they have. So I must say that I think Graham has and Republican Britain probably has a much easier role to pointing it out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. I think that, and I think we're going to probably talk about this in a future program. But you know, if you reform the monarchy too much, it becomes harder to argue against when it's still wrong in principle and it's still wrong for all sorts of reasons. But the political and constitutional angle becomes less acute. But I don't think that's likely to happen in this country. So these issues will remain very serious. I guess they still tried to bury it by talking about, either not talking about it at all. So, for example, the Privy Council is a very serious part of our constitution, but hardly anyone ever talks about it other than referring to it as a purely ceremonial body, which it isn't. Or they blame the politicians for everything and don't allow any blame to go anywhere near the members of the royal family, which, you know, to a large extent is correct. It's politicians that exercise most of those powers, but you know, we don't know the extent to which the monarch or some of her family might intervene behind closed doors. But the Privy Council is a cabinet body or government body which meets with the Queen, and this is where the royal powers are exercised. So a number of ministers relevant to whatever decisions being made will go to Buckingham Palace, and they stand in a semicircle and they read out orders in council. So it could be something fairly trivial. It could be something very serious, like declaring war, for example. And the Queen simply says agreed or deferred, which means it will be, you know, sort of dealt with at a later date. But she's not using her own discretion on that. She's doing what's required by the government. But essentially, this is the way in which the government can bypass Parliament and go to the palace and exercise real power using the Queen's authority. And these meetings are not properly reported or minuted or scrutinised, and the decisions don't go to Parliament for proper scrutiny either. So that's quite a serious aspect of this, of the Constitution with Britain.
Yeah. So, but would you say that you have an easier task in the UK than in Sweden and Netherlands?
Well, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's hard. I think I've always been struck in the last 10 years that we've had the AERM. The similarities, I think, are far greater than the differences. I think there's an issue of scale, perhaps. Ours is probably larger, more expensive, more ostentatious. I think our royal family are, how can I put this politely, stranger as people. I think they're more sort of stuck in the past than perhaps some of the European ones are. And it is more famous, I suppose. I mean, people do know that Britain has a monarchy. So yeah, I suppose it's a relatively easy target, but then again, it is well protected by media and political classes.
Yeah.
May I react to that, because I think you made well, you said it as a joke. You know, they are rather odd. I think that's the whole idea of a monarchy. If you point out people and say, you know, you have absolute power, but just confined by law, obviously people become a little bit weird. If wherever you go, people cheer at you without even having to prove whatever you do. You get a little bit weird. I think you get a little bit strange, a little bit odd. So no, I don't think it's just the British monarchy who's odd. I think our royal family, called the Oranges or the family of Orange, have quite a bit of oddness to it.
So what do you say about that, Ole?
Yeah, I actually agree with that wholeheartedly, because you can see in sort of the young Swedish pop culture, the king has sort of become this meme where he is this absurd character in a sort of semi-nationalistic way, but it's definitely stemming from the viewing them sort of as an obscure group of people. So I think you have something there, like you're putting a finger on something very important.
Yeah. So maybe that leads us to our other question, our second question today, about informal power and influencing on our societies. So will you start and describe that, Floris?
Yeah, well, the list of informal power is rather long. I said they have a lot of formal powers, but that's all limited by law. If you look at the informal power or the privileges, as one might say, it's endless, and new things keep popping up. The latest things we've heard was that our king has the right to hunt in a very large national park we have. He's paid for that, and he has the right to do that 3 months in a row. The whole thing is closed down for public. Nobody knows what happens, and he gets millions for it. So that's the very latest thing we've had, actually, and this is quite unusual for the Dutch press, as mostly they're not that negative or very critical about the monarchy. This came out, this led to some discussion, but as all discussion about the monarchy dies out very fast again. But we've had an endless list of things that have turned out mostly cash-minded. Quite recently, they have a royal boat, and that was given as a present 40 years ago. Almost 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And as it turns out, that is being renovated every year on cost of our Ministry of Defense. They have endless powers. They travel abroad a lot. And they have even limited, and I think that's a very other interesting point to make, they have limited our Dutch press, whereas everybody in Holland can be photographed in whatever they do, especially people in power. Our royal family has limited it to the press and has put upon the Dutch press legal contract saying you can only make pictures of us twice a year, half an hour whenever we go skiing, and whenever we go on holiday, you have half an hour, and for the rest, that's it. You don't make any pictures of us, you don't write about us, unless we tell you what to write or what to bring a picture. So I think that again is something that is a privilege nobody has, and then maybe that's a little bit in between formal and informal or privilege. But they have whenever I have a problem, whenever somebody writes something about me as just an ordinary Dutch citizen, I can go to court and say, I don't really like this, and try to make a case out of that. If the king does that, we have a special book in our law system for the king, and that has changed a little, but until quite recently, if you would insult the king, that would lead to years and years and years of imprisonment. Formally, that never, fortunately, that never, a prison like that was never given, but still, that's a privilege as well. So it keeps, and the list is endless. We've had numerous historic things that popped out where everybody, put up their eyebrows and said, this is rather weird, but it's as said, because I think that the privileges derive from their formal power, and these are just accesses of formal power. And as we don't know what their formal power is or what they do with the formal power, in the end, these things keep on popping up. But obviously, and that's the very last thing to say, is we have an institution called the Rijksvoorlichtingsdienst, which is the
Okay, we got that.
yeah, it's the state information service, where it's like the propaganda service of our monarchy, and they see to it that whatever happens concerning our monarchy, that it's put into a certain place. So no negative news, no critical way of looking at it, but they'll always say, that there's a little bit of a surrounding in that.
But would you say that the king and queen and the royal family in the Netherlands are popular among common people?
Well, that's the interesting thing. We have a so-called survey every year around King's Day, which is in the end of April. This year, unfortunately, things didn't go through because of Corona, but we have that end of April usually. And you have two news services who present a survey on the popularity of our king and queen and of the different members of our royal family. And the interesting thing is they really focus on the people. And that question is, how much do you like them? It's not how much do you like the monarchy, how much do you like this institution, how much do you like the fact that we have a certain family, that just because they're born in a certain family, they have certain rights. So yes, well, and in this survey, it always turns out that say 70-75% of the people in Holland like them this and that much, and our queen, who comes originally from Argentina, is very popular and does things very well. But it's never really put into place. It's never whether you like them actually being there. No, it's just how much do you like them, and I don't think that's the right question to ask.
Okay. Yeah. So, Ole, what do you think about informal power and influence in Sweden?
Oh, yeah. So where to start? I think one of the I'll sort of do two main ones. We were a little short on time to do everything, but I would argue first we have sort of the economic influence, where they amass a large fortune, large personal wealth. That's different from the sort of money that we give to them each year, where they collect arts and they control buildings and whatnot, which means that through these informal, well, they are formal strategies, but it is informal in the sense that it's not codified anywhere. They can control a large wealth share, of course. And the second part is that they have a lot of powerful friends, and these friends sort of in the business area or in other sectors, they can in turn influence politics, I would say. So when we talk about informal power here, I would say that of course you have the sort of well, they're powerful people in and of itself because they're royal, but the truth is they do have a lot of powerful friends, and you shouldn't discount that when you talk about political influence. I feel like I would say those are the two most important informal powers that we wield.
Do you have some example of the last thing you said?
The powerful people?
Yeah.
Well, it is well known that a lot of important people have had at some point an audience with the king or whatever, and he had one of his most famous friends was Noppe, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago in a tragic way, and he has been documented to hang out in his youth with some rather skeevy people in the Stockholm nightlife. So yeah, those are the examples that I would give straight up. I would have to look into if you want names.
Yeah, thank you. So what about the situation of informal power in the UK?
Well, I mean, it's quite substantial. I mean, it again is a sort of it's informal, but it's backed up by formal structures and laws and that kind of thing. What's interesting is that, unlike, I was quite surprised at what Floris was saying about the rules around taking photos of them, and the press seems to be perhaps a little bit kinder to the royals in the Netherlands. I mean, our press is notorious for being unkind to pretty much everybody and anybody if it sells papers, and they have no qualms about criticising the royals, or they tend to stay away from criticising the Queen unless it's a really significant problem. But the informal power comes through primarily through the secrecy that surrounds them, and the fact that the Queen and Charles in particular, they have complete protection in terms of anything they might want to say to ministers. There's no way that we can find out what they're saying. The Queen has weekly meetings with the Prime Minister, and there's no one else in that room. There's no minutes being taken, so she can say whatever she likes. And the former Prime Minister, Conservative Prime Minister, John Major, admitted a few years ago that there were some of these meetings where he would leave the meeting having had his mind changed by the Queen. That's quite extraordinary. She's got no mandate to persuade or influence the Prime Minister. Prince Charles, of course, famously writes lots of letters. I mean, dozens of them. Every week he is writing to someone trying to influence them on public policy, and we have no right to know what he's writing and to who. And he also then has direct access to ministers in terms of inviting them to meet him, and he has direct access to all cabinet papers, which means he has knowledge of what government might be wanting to do well before anybody else, including some other government ministers who don't have access to everything that goes through the cabinet. This creates two areas of influence. One is to protect their own interests. So they've been lobbying for better financial settlements. They've been lobbying for more secrecy, and that was given to them 10 years ago. And also to push for their own political agenda. So Prince Charles has views on everything from architecture to education to health. One particular direct example is homeopathy. So homeopathy is a alternative medicine that the medical profession in the UK does not support, and is widely viewed as being completely bogus. But the NHS has spent money on it over the last few decades, and it is believed by those in the know that is to some extent the result of lobbying from Prince Charles and the Queen, who support homeopathy. So it's quite a serious problem in that sense. If you are, let's say, for example, you set yourself up as a campaign group to have homeopathy taken off the NHS, you're taken out of the NHS system, you really don't know what you're up against. You don't know what's being done behind closed doors. You can't find out what meetings or discussions are being had with people in the royal household. So that's quite significant. The other thing is that the Queen is also the Duke of Lancaster, and Prince Charles is the Duke of Cornwall. And in those roles, they have other rights and privileges. And one of the most extraordinary is that if a law is going through the British Parliament, if it affects their private interests, then they have to give consent to that law for it to go through and become, to complete its passage through Parliament. And that's not a formality. That is a real thing. So the upshot of that is that they always give consent, because the civil service makes sure that the law is tailored to give them exemptions. Either they are not covered by the law, or they are covered, and the law says that they would be immune from prosecution should they break it. And the Duchy of Cornwall is a large business. It's a landowner, a landlord, a property developer, and so on, and an employer as well. So there's a vast range of laws that would fall within that definition of affecting Prince Charles's private interests, and he gets to ensure that he is exempted where necessary. The strangest one being we have a law, I don't know why, but we have a law that bans the detonation of or the causing of nuclear explosions in the UK, and you would assume that was taken as read that would be illegal, but but for some reason, Prince Charles could not be prosecuted if he decided to detonate a nuclear bomb in Cornwall. So it's that, that's the weirdest example, but there are plenty which are very serious, to do with planning, for example, to do with building new developments in the countryside, and environmental regulations and so on.
Okay. I would just figure if we have some questions from the audience. Would our background technical person, Bram, let us know that? Or otherwise, we don't have any questions. Here we go. From Britain, how come British people accept the duchy? The fact that Prince Charles and other royals own big parts of the country.
Well, the big problem is that everyone calls it their private estate. And so the media often refer to the Duchy of Cornwall as his private estate. And so people think, well, that's fair enough. It's his private estate. That's his business. And people don't really know how big it is. It's actually very, very large. I mean, it's I can't remember the precise figures, but it's much larger than a number of our big cities. If you take it all together as take all the land that's scattered across England, it's a substantial estate, one of the largest in the country. But people don't really know how big it is, and they don't. They are constantly told it's a private estate rather than what it really is, which is crown property and should be in the hands of the state. So, but I do think that people do react quite strongly when they find out the truth, and certainly when they find out what that means, particularly for people that live on his land and have to put up with him as a landlord.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I think we should sum up, and just a short question to all of you. What do you think? What does your country stand out in law and informal power compared to the others? What are the really distinctive differences between your country and the other countries that we've been talking about? Who would like to start? Floris, yeah.
Your mic is muted, Floris.
So you saw my face move, but you didn't hear me. Probably you hear me now.
Yes.
No, I think what the interesting thing is, especially as we've been comparing with Sweden and with Great Britain, I think that the the British Queen obviously has more formal power and probably more privileges, and she earns a lot as all the other members of the royal family. But we are a very small country, and still what you see is, yes, the formal power is limited, but behind the screens, there is so much power. We don't know what's going on. If you compare money-wise, a lot of money is spent on our monarchy. We have this institution that focuses on propaganda, getting the positive news out. And we have a certain law that none of your countries has, in which the press freedom is just limited, especially concerning royal news. So I think all that, yes, maybe it's not as absurd as in Britain, but being a very small country and having all this in place, I think we do stand out.
Okay, thank you. What do you think, Ole?
I think what stands out in the Swedish model is how limited the formal powers actually are constitutionally, and I think that reflects the sort of compromise that our current constitution is between the conservative bloc and the essentially social democratic or left liberal bloc. That formal powers are very, very limited, but as we've discussed, the informal powers are still great.
Thank you. And what about you, Graham, in the UK?
Yeah, I think our monarchy stands out for all sorts of awful reasons, but I think that what's always been interesting to me is how similar our monarchies are, and it is often a question of scale, as Laura said. Netherlands is a small country, but the issues are still there, but perhaps on a smaller scale. And in this country, we're often told, oh well, maybe we could reform the monarchy, maybe we could have what's called a bicycling monarchy, and they say, can we have this monarchy that they have in the Netherlands, where they imagine that this is a humble family that is not costing.
You can have a humble family if you really want them.
Cycles to work and they all hold down normal jobs. This is the fantasy that exists here, where some people think that they can compromise with us and say, well, let's keep the monarchy, but have this kind of fantasy family that they think exists in the Netherlands. I mean, the point is, it wouldn't work in this country. Our royal family's never going to do that. But I think it's also a lesson not to compromise on this, because there isn't a compromise. It's a binary issue. Either we have a monarchy or we don't. What that monarchy looks like and how bad it is really not the point. The point is we have a monarchy and we shouldn't. Our heads of state should be elected either directly by the people or by Parliament, and they should be subjected to all the same sort of standards and norms that we expect of everybody else in the country. So, and I think that on those core points, we are very, very similar. And we also see what happens. This is the problem. We all see what happens when you put someone in public office with access to public institutions and public money. They will always do the wrong thing. The temptation is great. Human nature is what it is. And people will think, well, okay, fine. If I can spend all that money and no one's going to complain, then why wouldn't I?
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll end our session today.
Can I just answer one question that I saw in the chat, because I thought it was interesting?
Yeah.
And it was early on by Emery Hurst, and it said, will citizens for a Canadian Republic be invited to take part in any programs in this series? And well, we're not opposed to it, provided we get a hold of them and we can find a time that works for everyone involved. So we'll see if we can make that happen. Basically, we have
a good relationship with them. I actually, just a quick plug, Republic has a podcast which you can find, Abolish the Monarchy podcast, which is on Apple and Spotify, and we just recorded a discussion with Canadian citizens for Canadian Republic and New Zealand Republic, which I think will be out on Monday. So catch up with that, and we'll see if we can get them on one of these programs in the future.
Great.
Yeah, thank you. I will just end by saying and making propaganda for our next live stream, and that will be in 4 weeks on the 23rd of July. And then we will talk about a question which we have touched several times today, and that is the cost of the monarchy, hidden and revealed costs. So you're all very welcome then, and thank you to the panel, and thank you for everyone who's been listening today, and see you in 4 weeks, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.